Boston, October 1864. The air reeked of chimney smoke, wet leaves, and something else, something faint and metallic, like blood soaked into old brick. Atop a hill in Beacon Hill's oldest quarter stood the Ashworth estate, a mansion so draped in ivy and shadow that even the gaslight seemed to avoid it. And it was here, on the night of October 12th, that 58 servants and hired hands vanished without so much as a dropped broom or an open door. By spring, 12 family members would be dead, each succumbing to sudden fevers, falls, or accidents so bizarre that local physicians whispered of poisoning. Yet it was not the bodies, nor the silences of empty rooms, that turned gossip into legend. It was the proclamation of the family patriarch, Colonel Edward Ashworth, made in the drawing-room before stunned cousins and half-drunk lawyers. "I shall wed Miss Clara this winter. The family must remain whole." Miss Clara, 17, golden-haired, and recently orphaned by a carriage fire that had devoured her mother and father on Tremont Street. She stood in silence as the colonel spoke, her eyes wide and unblinking. When a cousin protested, Edward raised a crystal decanter and laughed. "The charter is clear. Ashworth wealth belongs to Ashworth blood. All of it. Every coin." You must wonder, what kind of madness grips a man to wed his own granddaughter? But this was no madness. It was tradition. It was doctrine. It was the circle of Providence. Boston in the mid-19th century was a city of contrasts, a place where cobbled alleys met marble institutions, and soot-blackened factories loomed behind rows of colonial brick homes. The Civil War still raged to the south, but in Beacon Hill, the war seemed far away, muffled by lace curtains and silver service. The Ashworths were among the oldest families in the city, their wealth tracing back to shipping ventures in the 1700s, though few could recall exactly which ventures, and fewer still dared to ask. Edward Ashworth, now approaching 70, was a relic of a fading era. A former colonel in the Massachusetts militia, he still walked with the bearing of command, his long coat always buttoned to the collar, a signet ring glinting like an eye on his right hand. He had outlived 2 wives and sired 5 children. All were dead by the autumn of '64, taken by cholera, consumption, or in the case of Clara's parents, a carriage blaze that left only charred silver buttons and a scorched pocket watch to identify the remains. The fire had started at the base of the driver's seat, burning fast and unnaturally hot, witnesses said. No one had seen it coming. The watch had stopped at 9:17 p.m. The official report listed it as accidental, but whispers in Back Bay tea parlors told a different story. Clara's father, Ambrose Ashworth, had begged and questioning the legality of the Ashworth Charter, a document Edward claimed had been passed from patriarch to heir for over a century. It outlined the rules of inheritance. Land must never be divided, wealth must never leave the bloodline, and the union of kin was, if necessary, permitted to preserve both. No one outside the family had ever read the full document. Some claimed it had been written in 1799 in a mix of English, Latin, and something older, symbols that looped and curved like serpents. Edward kept it locked in a black wood chest in the cellar, beside 3 other documents bound in pale, waxy leather. Clara would later write in her journal, "The papers smell like salt and rot. I think one is bound in skin." By October, Edward had dismissed most of the household staff. Those who remained, maids, footmen, the cook, and 4 hired stable hands, lived in a row of damp stone rooms beneath the kitchen. Then, one morning, they were simply gone. Beds left unmade. Soup cooling on the stove. The coal cellar door ajar, dragging marks in the dust. The Boston Courier ran a brief notice. Unusual absence at Ashworth House, 58 employees missing. Police attribute it to wartime desertions. But there was no sign of desertion, no packed bags, no farewells. A neighbor's daughter, Betsy Flannery, later claimed she heard a low horn at 3 in the morning, like something blown beneath the earth, followed by the sound of heavy boots marching away. Within 2 weeks, 4 members of the extended Ashworth family were dead. A cousin drowned in the horse trough. An aunt fell down the stairs and snapped her neck. 2 nephews succumbed to a sudden fever. their lips blackened and their fingernails blue. One physician noted that their symptoms resembled strychnine poisoning. He was later found unconscious in his apothecary, having inhaled a broken jar of ether. Through it all, Colonel Ashworth remained a figure of control. He sent out invitations to a small family gathering on the 15th of November, where he publicly announced the upcoming union between himself and Clara, who stood beside him in silence, pale and rigid as porcelain. She wore black gloves, and when someone asked why, she replied, "For mourning, sir." Reverend Ellsworth, a Unitarian minister, refused to officiate the marriage. "It is an abomination," he told a city official. "If I am forced to sanction such a thing, I shall burn my collar." The Reverend was found dead 3 days later, drowned in the Charles River. The police declared it a suicide. His diary, which surfaced decades later, contained only one entry for that week. "He showed me the medallion. The snake. He said it watches itself, feeds itself. I saw something in the Colonel's eyes that I shall never unsee. It was as if the man had been hollowed out, and something older had crawled inside." There were stories, ones no paper dared print, of the Circle of Providence. A brotherhood older than the Revolution, formed by wealthy families who believed in the sanctity of lineage. They spoke of pure blood as not just a social ideal, but a metaphysical one. That certain names, passed down unmixed, created something more than human. Members of the circle bore medallions, a serpent eating its own tail, cast in blackened bronze, with an inscription in Latin: Ut sanguis purus in aeternum florit. That pure blood may flourish forever. These medallions were not worn on the outside, but on the inside, sewn into coats, pressed against skin. Clara would later describe them as hot to the touch, even on the coldest nights. One of Edward's surviving nieces, Helena, tried to flee to New York. Her carriage was overturned just outside Lowell. Witnesses say the driver jerked the reins as if blinded, and that Helena screamed for nearly an hour as they tried to free her from the wreck. By the time they did, she was silent, and her eyes had turned white. Edward claimed she suffered from nerves. Meanwhile, Clara withdrew from society. She rarely left her room and was not seen in church again after October. The maids were gone. The corridors grew dusty. Mirrors were covered with cloth, and the windows remained shuttered even in daylight. But in secret, Clara had begged and searching. It started with a lockbox hidden behind a panel in her father's study. Inside were journals, her father's, and a collection of letters he had never sent. Many were addressed to government officials, others to unnamed parties, warning of Edward's degeneracy, fraud, and pagan heresies. He had accused his father of selling Ashworth land to foreign agents of a darker rite, and misappropriating funds meant for war widows and children. And there were sketches, crude but unmistakable, of tunnels. Tunnels beneath the mansion. Clara waited until the 4th night of November, when the house was at its coldest and the grandfather clock struck 2 with a sound like bone against bell. Edward had long since retired to his library, where the scent of pipe smoke and cognac soaked into the velvet curtains like rot in damp soil. He read late into the night, though no one ever saw what books he turned over in those heavy hands. Once, Clara caught a glimpse of one, bound in leather so dark it drank the candlelight. She moved barefoot down the servants' stair, holding her skirts above the dust and plaster grit. The house creaked like a ship, and every gust of wind against the shutters made her freeze, breath shallow. A single candle flickered in her hand, the wax dripping onto her glove. Behind the disused pantry, Clara found the latch her father had drawn in his sketches. The panel was warped but not locked. It opened with a reluctant groan to reveal a short passage, descending behind the brick foundation. The air changed instantly, no longer dry and musty, but damp and mineral-rich, like cellars sealed since the Puritans. She descended into the earth. The first chamber she entered had once been a coal room, but had been gutted and expanded. Stones carved with symbols ringed the walls, interlocking spirals, a three-eyed serpent, a tree with roots growing into a skull. In the center sat an iron basin, blackened by fire. Around it, Clara counted 13 copper stakes driven into the stone floor. Dried residue clung to each. She didn't need training to recognize blood. She pressed forward, heart racing. What she found next was not a single tunnel, but an entire system. Twisting hallways carved crudely by hand, some reinforced with rotting timbers. The deeper she went, the older it felt. Rusted chains dangled from hooks. Wooden doors hung ajar on crooked hinges. Some rooms had beds straw rotted to dust. Others held only piles of bone. Human bone. The skulls were small. Dozens of them. Children. Some bore the marks of blunt trauma. Others, long incisions carved into the crown. She covered her mouth but didn't scream. She couldn't. Not here, where sounds seemed to vanish into the cold, heavy dark. A small alcove at the far end revealed something worse. A wall of names, hundreds of them, scratched into plaster with a nail or blade. Many were repeated, marked with tally lines. Girls. Women. Some names were written in elegant English. Others were in crude block script. But one recurred more than any other. C. Ashworth. Clara stepped back. The candle flickered violently. In the adjacent room, she found 3 coffins, none sealed. Inside lay desiccated remains dressed in wedding finery. White lace, black ribbons, veils drawn over collapsed skulls. All wore identical rings, gold bands with the Ouroboros symbol, the serpent eating its tail. One clutched a bouquet of dried herbs. Belladonna. Another still had wax in her ears. On the far wall, behind a torn curtain of velvet, she discovered what could only be called an altar. Hewn from dark granite, it bore deep grooves and claw-like carvings. On it sat a book, bound in grey hide. She dared not touch it. But beneath it lay a paper note, freshly folded. The blood of the Virgin awakens the root. The union seals the line. The child of the old shall walk unbroken. She fled. Clara did not sleep that night. She burned the hem of her dress and scrubbed her hands until they bled. But the blood she saw in her dreams was not hers. It poured in rivers beneath the mansion, filling the mouths of stone idols and soaking the names on the wall. When morning came, she returned to the room where her father's journals were hidden. She read them all. Ambrose had known. He had fought his father for years, first as a young man returning from Harvard with liberal ideas, then as a husband trying to shield his wife from Edward's influence. He had nearly succeeded in escaping the charter. The journals detailed his attempts to contact abolitionist groups, Masonic defectors, and even Union generals who had heard whispers of Providence's circle during campaigns through the South. Edward believes the line must remain pure, Ambrose wrote. He thinks he is guarding something eternal. But he is only preserving a lie carved in rot. In the final entry, dated just 2 weeks before the fire, Ambrose wrote of a confrontation. I told him I would not sign. That I would not give Clara over to their rights. He told me the fire would come if I broke the chain. Now I see what he meant. If this reaches you, Clara, run. Run, and bury this house behind you. Instead, Clara began planning. She could not run. Not yet. Not without answers. And not without revenge. She returned to the tunnels twice more in secret. Once to draw a crude map of the corridors, and a second time to retrieve a small handful of bone from the ossuary and a sample of powder from the altar's grooves, white ash mixed with something darker. Hair, perhaps. At the apothecary on Tremont Street, she purchased dried foxglove, monk's hood, and wolfsbane under the pretense of treating fainting spells. The apothecary, a thin man with ink on his cuffs, warned her about each. These are not teas, miss. They'll still a heart or seize the breath if prepared improperly. She smiled. Then I shall be very precise. Back at the estate, she soaked candles in monk's hood oil and scraped powder into the wax with a dull knife. The wine, she would lace with foxglove, measured not to K*LL outright, but to slow and confuse. Meanwhile, she wrote. Dozens of letters, anonymous, cryptic, but filled with enough detail to stir suspicion. She sent them to Boston newspapers, federal officers, and even to a Union major she knew had worked with her father once, long ago. Each began the same way. There is a place in Boston where blood is power, and the old gods are fed by children. Each ended the same. The circle is still among you. But not for long. She mailed them on the 1st of December. Edward, perhaps sensing her withdrawal, became more controlling. He demanded she dine with him nightly, quoting obscure laws and family edicts she had never heard. He spoke of the long chain of flesh, of the root that must feed. He gave her a ring, cold, heavy, and forced it onto her finger. You are the fruit of 3 generations of perfect blood, he whispered, brushing a lock of hair from her cheek. After the ceremony, you shall be the root. Clara said nothing. But that night she sharpened a pair of sewing scissors and sewed a hidden pocket into her corset. She lined it with crushed glass and 2 fingers' worth of belladonna paste. The wedding was scheduled for October 13th. At dusk. Underground. By the time October 13th arrived, the Ashworth mansion stood like a mausoleum. Its windows were dark, its gaslights extinguished, and ivy had begun to overtake the southern wing, curling like veins across the brick. The city had quieted. War rumors still clung to the papers, but Boston had turned inward for winter. Few noticed the covered carriage that arrived at the estate just after sunset, nor the half-dozen figures who emerged, all dressed in black, their collars turned high. They were not guests in the traditional sense. They were members of the circle. The ceremony would not be held in the drawing-room, nor in the garden chapel, which had long since been stripped of its altar and pews. No, the wedding would take place underground, in the stone womb where the family's secrets were born and buried. Edward wore formal attire, a black frock coat embroidered with gold thread, a crimson sash across his chest, and the serpent medallion displayed proudly at his throat. His beard had been freshly combed, his white hair oiled and slicked back. His eyes, though clouded with age, burned with purpose. Clara descended the staircase with deliberate grace. Her dress was white, but not bright. It had the dull gleam of bone. Her veil was ash-gray lace, and her gloves, stained at the fingertips, concealed the belladonna paste she had worked into the seams. Around her neck hung not a crucifix, but the ring Edward had given her. The guests stood in a ring around the altar. There were 11 in total, each bearing the circle's mark, some on their medallions, others tattooed at the base of the neck. One was a banker. Another, a surgeon. A judge from Salem. A retired general. All men of influence. All bound by the same oath, preserve the bloodline. At any cost. Candles were lit, 42 of them, placed in concentric circles. Their flames flickered blue, a hue produced by the poisons Clara had steeped in the wax. The smoke rose in thin, wavering tendrils, slow and sweet-smelling. The officiant stepped forward, a man in a hooded robe, his voice dry as parchment. He did not begin with scripture, but with Latin. Ex sanguine nascitur potestas. Ex potestate aeternitas. From blood is born power. From power, eternity. Edward took Clara's hand. His skin was cold. She did not flinch. As he began the vows, written not on paper but etched in bone, they chanted around her. The guests moved rhythmically, their eyes closed, lips muttering old syllables passed down since the charter's first ink dried. Clara's pulse slowed. The wine was poured, dark as ink, served in silver goblets etched with runes. She had laced Edward's cup with foxglove. Enough to blur his vision. Enough to still his heart, if only for a few minutes. When he raised the goblet to his lips, he paused. A single drop trembled at the rim. She smiled, and toasted. To the blood unbroken. He drank. So did the guests. And slowly, so very slowly, the circle began to unravel. The candles flared first, their blue flames hissing as they released vapors into the chamber. The judge coughed. The general rubbed his eyes. One of the guests dropped to his knees, vomiting black bile onto the stone floor. Still they tried to chant, half lost now, their voices wavering, slurred. Edward staggered. The goblet clattered from his fingers, ringing as it rolled. He turned to Clara, blinking slowly. What have you? I read the charter. she whispered, stepping back. I read everything. She drew the scissors from her sleeve, not to strike, but to cut the cord binding her glove to her wrist. It fell away, revealing the blisters where Belladonna had already begged *N to burn her skin. She tossed the glove onto the altar, where it smoldered and hissed. You said the line must remain unbroken, she said. But some lines are meant to die. Chaos broke like thunder. The surgeon tried to rise, clawing at his throat. One of the guests collapsed into the basin, eyes wide, lips foaming. The hooded officiant cried out, but his words dissolved into coughing. Edward stumbled forward, hands reaching, eyes wild with fury, or fear. Clara turned and ran. Through the candle ring, past the altar, and into the corridor beyond, where she had earlier scattered powder from her father's *N cabinet, fine grains of blasting powder, carefully wrapped in wax paper and tucked beneath the bones of the altar room. Along the way, she lit her last candle, a simple match sparked it, and dropped it onto the oiled wick trailing behind her. The wick hissed to life. She fled down the tunnel, into the deepest corridor, where a side passage opened into the old root cellar. There, hidden behind crates, was the escape route her father had once used during his own investigation, a service tunnel leading to the northern boundary of the estate, under the hedge line. Behind her, the mansion shook. The explosion began with a crack, not thunder, but something deeper. Then the roar came, rolling through the tunnels like a beast unleashed. Stone split. Flame licked the old beams. Smoke filled the lungs of the dying circle. Clara did not look back. She burst into the open air just as the sky turned orange behind her. The earth trembled. The western wing collapsed inward. Flames licked the sky in strange shapes, curling like serpents. The upper balcony where Edward once read in the mornings crumbled into dust. The conservatory, glass and wrought iron, shattered outward in a blossom of fire. Clara dropped to her knees among the hedges, coughing. Her dress torn, her hair singed, her hands blistered. And the Ashworth line was broken. The fire was seen as far as Cambridge. By dawn, only a smoldering shell remained of the Ashworth estate, charred stone, twisted beams, and a column of smoke that hovered above Beacon Hill like a funeral shroud. Fire brigades arrived too late. The mansion, they reported, had collapsed inward before they reached the gates. The north wing had fallen into itself, forming a crater filled with ash and flickering embers. The newspapers offered a tidy explanation. Explosion at Ashworth Estate. Authorities cite powder cellar accident. Boston Courier, October 14, 1864. The article ran barely half a column. It mentioned structural flaws, improper storage of black powder, and the confirmed deaths of several house guests. Colonel Edward Ashworth was named among the casualties. No mention was made of a wedding. No mention of Clara. She had disappeared. In the days following the explosion, Boston was consumed not by grief, but by speculation. The Ashworth name, once spoken with reverence, was now muttered behind gloves and passed in cryptic notes. Rumors spiraled. Edward had gone mad. The house was cursed. Servants had performed some kind of ritual and summoned fire from beneath the earth. Those who had once attended Ashworth galas now denied knowing him. His investments were quietly dissolved. Ashworth Bank merged with a new firm under a different name. Properties in Newburyport and Providence were sold at a loss. His portrait was removed from the Athenaeum. But Clara's letters had reached their marks. Weeks after the fire, a federal investigator named Silas Moreland arrived from Washington, bearing sealed orders and a sharp sense of curiosity. He interviewed survivors, or what few remained. The groundskeeper was found dead in his home, wrist slashed. A seamstress who had once worked for Clara was confined to a sanatorium after repeated night terrors. She screamed, "The serpent is still hungry!" until her voice gave out. Moreland pressed further. In one recovered letter, and signed, but written in a hand traced to Clara's school records, he found this passage. "The circle is not a fiction. It is a fraternity of power bound by blood and ritual. My grandfather believed blood could bend time, seal fate, cheat death. He believed I would give him eternity. I gave him ashes instead. Moreland reopened old property records, marriage ledgers, and death certificates from across Massachusetts. Patterns emerged. A concentration of unusual deaths tied to certain surnames. Recurring symbols carved into hearthstones and headboards. A series of stillbirths among families who had once claimed pure stock. He shared his findings with the U.S. Attorney's Office. 2 days later, Moreland disappeared. His body was never found. His room at the Tremont House was left undisturbed, save for a single scorch mark across the rug. The documents were gone. Only the hotel ledger remained, with the final entry. Gone to speak with a Clara. Boston moved on. The winter of 1864 was harsh. Ice choked the harbor and the street lamps froze in their brackets. By spring, the Ashworth ruins had been fenced off. Children dared each other to climb the blackened walls. Some claimed to hear whispers in the rubble. Others swore they saw a girl in white, standing among the ashes, her hair blowing though no wind stirred. In 1870, a group of laborers attempted to excavate the site to lay new foundations. They uncovered bones, hundreds of them. Many were small. Some still wore fragments of jewelry or silk. Work was halted. The site declared historically sensitive. No building has stood there since. But the legacy of the circle endured, if only in shadows. In 1873, Judge Horace Bell of Salem vanished from his study. The only clue, a scorched medallion left in his fireplace, engraved with a serpent devouring its own tail. A decade later, 2 prominent doctors from Cambridge were found dead in a locked room, hands clasped around identical rings. And in 1889, a series of fires swept through old mansions in Newport, Connecticut, destroying archives, portraits, and family crests, some bearing the same Ouroboros symbol seen at Ashworth House. Clara was never officially declared dead. She remained in the records, missing since the incident. But sightings continued for years. A woman in a gray veil, always alone, boarding trains late at night. A visitor to the graves of war orphans in Hartford. A pale figure seen walking along the banks of the Charles each autumn, singing softly in a voice just loud enough to unsettle. In 1891, an envelope arrived at the Boston Courier, addressed in faded ink. Inside was a single page. The circle has broken, but its shadow remains. If blood built Boston, then blood will always stain its stones. I am not a bride. I am the reckoning. C.A. It was never published. But the editor, a man named Elias Greeley, resigned the same day. He left the city and never returned. In his final note to his wife, he wrote, "I have read something no man should read. We built this city on haunted ground." And so the tale of the Ashworths faded into the realm of ghost stories and legend. But each autumn, when the leaves fall like burning parchment and the wind carries whispers down the alleyways of Beacon Hill, some say you can still hear the echo of that long-ago ceremony, the chanting, the screams, the voice of a young woman declaring her freedom in fire. They call it the darkest union in Boston. The grandfather who tried to marry his granddaughter, and the girl who burned him from history. The ruins of the Ashworth estate still stand, though the stones are now overgrown with ivy and thyme. They lie just beyond a black iron fence on the edge of Beacon Hill, partially hidden behind a grove of crooked trees that should not have survived the Boston winters but somehow always bloomed too early, and too red. No city map marks the place anymore. It is simply a vacant lot, zoned for nothing, watched by no one. But the ground remembers. Each year, on the night of October 13th, the air turns unnaturally still around the site. Dogs refuse to pass it. Lanterns flicker. And those foolish or curious enough to step inside, historians, thrill-seekers, or students from the theological college nearby, often return pale and silent. Some never return at all. There are stories, of course. Whispers passed down through generations of Bostonians. An archivist once found a journal buried behind a false wall in the old city records building. The last entry read, "We have scrubbed every mention of the circle, as instructed. But the name keeps resurfacing. On deeds. In wills. Etched beneath floorboards. One cannot erase blood with ink. Another tale, often told by elderly tour guides on ghost walks, concerns a stone discovered beneath the foundation of a demolished tenement in Roxbury in 1903. It bore an inscription so worn it could barely be read, but those who touched it reported strange dreams, of candlelight in tunnels, of serpents whispering in Latin, of a woman in white singing over bones. The stone was moved to a museum in Salem. It disappeared 3 days later. Even today, historians struggle with the Ashworth account. Official documents remain sealed or lost. No legal charter naming the Circle of Providence survives in any archive. And yet, references remain, in probate court records, medical diaries, and letters from Union officers stationed in Massachusetts. What they all share is an unshakable sense of dread. The mansion's foundation has long since been swallowed by the soil, but remnants resurface after heavy rain, scorched bricks, twisted metal, and once, a scorched ring, gold, with each Ouroboros symbol melted but still visible. It now resides in a private collection at Harvard under the vague label Ritual Artifact, Provenance Unknown. And then there is the voice. Dozens of reports, separated by decades, by social class, by culture, speak of the same phenomenon. A woman's voice, low and clear, humming a tune no one can place. It always comes in late October, between the hours of midnight and 1. Sometimes it's heard near the ruins. Sometimes from basements in houses 2 blocks away. Once, a soldier recovering from war injuries at Massachusetts General claimed to hear it through the stone wall of his ward. He died that night smiling. Witnesses describe the melody as sad, but not mournful. Lyrical, but not quite human. In 1932, a spiritualist medium attempted a séance near the ruins. She entered a trance and spoke in a language no one recognized, then collapsed. Her last word before falling unconscious was, "Clara." When she awoke, she refused to speak again. She died in an asylum 4 months later, having scratched serpents into her cell wall until her fingers bled. The city chose silence. The neighborhood around Beacon Hill continued to gentrify. Brownstones were restored. Gas lamps were electrified. But the lot where the Ashworth house stood remains untouched. Real estate developers avoid it. When asked why, one prominent investor once said, "The ground, it feels wrong under your feet." As for Clara Ashworth, her true fate remains unknown. Some say she fled to the Adirondacks under an assumed name. Others claim she lived in Paris for a time, under the care of a forgotten branch of the abolitionist resistance. One theory posits she joined a cloistered convent in Quebec, known for sheltering war widows and women of crisis. But the most persistent rumor holds that she never left Boston at all. A former librarian at the Boston Athenaeum recalled a patron in the 1880s, always veiled, always silent, who checked out books on ancient law, ethnobotany, and the mysticism of bloodlines. She never gave a name, but the address in the register was left blank. After she stopped visiting, the staff found a pressed flower between the pages of a returned volume. Belladonna. In a private collection of Civil War letters, a note was discovered bearing the same elegant hand found in the anonymous missive sent to the courier in 1864. The ink had faded, but the final line remained sharp. To be born to monsters is not to become one. But to remain silent, that is a greater sin. Perhaps she died in obscurity. Perhaps she lived long enough to see the circle's branches wither, one poisoned family at a time. Or perhaps she walked still, unaging, either ghost nor woman, a root that refused to rot. Whatever truth lies behind the stories, one fact remains: no other family in Boston's history vanished so completely, and so violently, as the Ashworths. No other name has been struck from so many ledgers, portraits, and plaques. And no other secret has remained so persistent in the bones of the city. Those who remember dare not speak too loud. And those who don't remember should not dig too deep. Because beneath the stone and ivy, beneath the silence of the fence, something still breathes. Not Edward. Not the circle. But the echo of a girl who stood before evil and lit the match herself. And every October she sings. In the winter of 1907, a box was discovered in the attic of a boarding school near Concord, Massachusetts. The school had once been a private residence, abandoned during the Civil War and repurposed in the 1880s. The box, walnut brass-hinged, unmarked, was found behind a false wall by a carpenter repairing a chimney. Inside were 12 letters. A pair of child-sized gloves. A faded brooch in the shape of a coiled serpent. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a diary. The handwriting matched several known samples of Clara Ashworth's correspondence. Most of the entries were mundane, weather observations, lists of herbs, names she had crossed off one by one. But the final entry, dated October 10, 1865, bore no title. Just a single paragraph written in a tight, deliberate hand. I dream of roots. Not flowers, not branches, roots. Long, pale tendrils threading through soil and bone, feeding on memory. We buried them in silence for too long. Now they feed in fire. But one must ask, if the root devours the dead, what becomes of the living? I am not the end. I am only the blade that cut the cord. The box was turned over to the Massachusetts Historical Society. For 2 years, it sat untouched in the archives. Then, quietly, it was moved to a restricted collection. When pressed, the curator simply replied, "We don't discuss Ashworth." And yet, fragments continued to surface. A coded letter intercepted in 1914 by British intelligence referenced the Providence lineage, in connection with pre-revolution occult societies. It mentioned the Ashworths by name, alongside 4 other American families whose genealogies ended abruptly in the 1860s. One line read, "The blood rights failed in Boston. The heir turned rogue. Circle scattered. Roots poisoned." In 1928, a professor of folklore at Miskatonic University presented a paper on the Ashworth affair, hypothesizing a broader cultic movement masked as eugenics. He died of heart failure 2 days later. The paper was withdrawn and the department chair resigned. In 1946, a local historian named Margaret Arliss attempted to write a book titled The House That Burned Itself. She traced Clara's childhood, her schooling, and the family's political affiliations. She obtained court documents, family trees, and fire reports, some of which had been declared lost. But before the book was completed, she vanished from her study. Only her notes remained, and a single scrawled phrase on her manuscript's last page. They were not trying to preserve blood. They were trying to trap time. The Ashworth site is now under permanent state protection. Officially, it's a heritage zone, with fragile archaeological sensitivity. Unofficially, no crews remain on site after dusk. No equipment is left overnight. In 1981, a graduate student from Tufts attempted to take plaster casts of the foundation. He went missing for 7 days. When found, he was naked and covered in ash, clutching a child's femur. He never spoke again. The girl's voice remains. In 2004, an audio engineer visiting from Germany took field recordings near the ruins, capturing ambient city sounds for a documentary on historical memory. Upon playback, he noticed a strange resonance, a melody, faint but precise. An old woman in a cafe recognized it instantly. "That's the wedding song," she said. "My grandmother used to hum it. Said it belonged to the girl who burned her family." The engineer isolated the sound and released a short clip online. The clip vanished within 72 hours, removed without explanation. His computer was destroyed in an apartment fire 3 weeks later. He moved back to Europe and refused further interviews. And still, people whisper. In Beacon Hill, older residents still refer to the old lot as Clara's ground. Children dare one another to climb the fence at night. Most don't. Some do, and return trembling, eyes rimmed red, unable to say what they saw. One boy simply muttered, "She watches the root. She keeps it buried." A local poet once tried to write a ballad about the Ashworths. His draft ended with this verse. "She sang beneath the stone and sky, where fire met blood and none knew why. The serpent wept, the circle torn, and from that night, no child was born." He never finished the poem. But even now, in quiet libraries and forgotten collections, The echoes persist: medallions, journal fragments, sketches of tunnels beneath Boston, maps with burned edges, names half erased, ledgers with whole families struck through in red ink, all pointing back to one night, one house, one girl. There are those who believe the circle still exists, fragmented, silent, operating under new names. That their doctrine adapted to new forms, scientific purity, elite legacy, bloodlines hidden behind glass towers instead of mansions. But if so, they fear only one name: Clara. Not as a woman, not as a martyr, but as a symbol. A flaw in the bloodline. The fruit of the tree turned poison. The voice that would not be silenced. In Boston's archives, an anonymous memo was once found stapled to the back of a genealogy chart. It read, "The child they sought to breed became the fire they could not contain. Let no one forget, the purest blood carries the deepest curse." And thus ends the story of the Ashworths. Not with a trial, nor a monument, but with silence. With empty graves and missing names. With a mansion turned to cinders. And a voice, still singing, somewhere beneath the streets of a city that has tried very hard to forget what it once was built upon. But some roots, once planted, never stop growing. They sleep. They wait. And sometimes, they remember.